So Elizabeth was again deep in thought, and after a time exclaimed to treat in such a manner the godson, a friend, the favorite of his father. She could have added, a young man too, like you, whose wear countenance may vouch for your being a Mabel, but she contented herself with and one too, who had probably been his own companion from childhood, connected together, as think you said, in the closest manner. We were born in the same parish, within the same park, the greatest part of your years was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements, objects of the same parental care. My father began life in the profession which your uncle Mr. Phillips appears to do so much credit to, but he gave up everything to be of use to the late Mr. Darcy. He was most highly esteemed by Mr. Darcy, a most intimate, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged himself to be under the greatest obligations to my father's active superintendence, and when immediately before my father's death, Mrs. Darcy gave him a voluntary promise of providing for me, I'm convinced that he felt it to be as much a debt of gratitude to him as of affection to myself. How strange, cried Elizabeth, how abominable. I wonder that the very pride of his Mr. Darcy has not made him just to you, from no better motive that he should not have been too proud to be dishonest, for dishonesty I must call it. It is wonderful. It is wonderful, replied Wickham, for almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride has often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with virtue than any other feeling, but we are none of us consistent, and his behavior to me there were stranger impulses, even the pride. Can such abominable pride as his have ever done him good? Yes, it has often led him to be liberal and generous, to give his money freely, to display hospitality, to assist his tenants, and relieve the poor. Family pride and filial pride, for he is very proud of what his father was, have done this, not to appear to disgrace his family, and degenerate from the popular qualities, or lose the influence of the Pemberley house as a powerful motive. He has also brotherly pride, which with some brotherly affection makes him a very kind and careful guardian of his sisters, and you will hear him generally cried up as the most attentive and best brothers. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable, as it gives me pain to speak ill of Darcy. But she is too much like her brother, very, very proud. As a child she was affectionate and pleasing and extremely fond of me, and I have devoted hours and hours to her amusement, but she is nothing to me now. She is a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and I understand highly accomplished. Since her father's death, her home has been London, where a lady lives with her and superintends her education. After many pauses and many trials of as their subjects, Elizabeth could not help reverting once more to the first and saying, I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humor itself and is, I really believe, truly amiable, be in friendship with such a man? How can they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He is a Sweet-tempered, amiable, charming. He cannot know what Mr. Darcy is. Probably not, but Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He doesn't want abilities. He can be a conversible, compassion if he thinks it worth his while. Among those who are at all his equals in consequence, he is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. His pride never deserts him, but with the rich he is liberal minded, just sincere, rational, honorable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune and figure. The whist part soon afterwards, breaking up, the players gathered round the other table, and Mr. Collins took his station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success were made by the latter. It had not been very great, it had lost every point, but when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern, thereupon he assured her with much earnest gravity that it was not of the least importance, that he considered the money as a mere trifle, and begged she would not make herself uneasy. I know very well, madam, said he, that when persons sit down to a card table, they must take their chance of the things, and happily I am not in such circumstances as to make 5 shillings any object. There are undoubtedly many who could not say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, am removed for beyond the necessity of regarding little matters. Mrs. Wickham's attention was caught, and after observing Mrs. Collins for a few moments, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relation were very intimately acquainted with the family of de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she replied, has very lightly given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Collins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long. You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, consequently that she is aunt to the present Miss Darcy. No, indeed, I didn't. I knew nothing at all of Lady Catherine's connections. I never heard of her existence till the day before yesterday. As a daughter, her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed that she and her cousin will unite the two estates. This information made Elizabeth smile as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain indeed must be all her attentions, vain and useless her affection to his sister, and her praise of herself, if he were already a self-destined to another. Mrs. Collins said she speaks highly both of Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited woman. I believe her to be both in great degree, replied Wickham. I have not seen her for many years, but I very well remember that I never liked her, and that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She has the reputation of being remarkably sensible and clever, but I rather believe she derives part of her abilities from her rank and fortune, part from her authoritative manner, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who chooses that everyone connected with him should have an understanding of the first class. Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and they continued talking together with mutual satisfaction till supper put an end to cards, and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mrs. Wickham's attentions. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but his manners recommended him to everybody. Whatever he said was said well, and whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but Mrs. Wickham, and Mr. Wickham and of what he had told her all the way home. But there was not time for her even to mention his name as they went, for neither Lydia nor Mr. Collins were once silent. Lydia talked incessantly of lottery tickets, of the fish and had lost, and the fish she had won, and Mr. Collins in describing the civility of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, protesting that he didn't in the least regard his losses at whist, in enumerating all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly fearing that he crowded his cousins, had more to say that than he could well manage before the carriage stopped at Longbourn House. Chapter 17. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham. The possibility of his having really endured such unkindness was enough to interest all her tender feelings, and nothing therefore remained to be done but to think well of them, to defend the conduct of each, and throw into the account of accident or mistake whatever could not be otherwise explained. They have both, said she, been deceived, I dare say, in some way or other, of which we can form no idea. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each to the other. It is in short impossible for us to conjecture the causes or circumstances which may have alliated them without actual blame on either side. Very true, indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say in behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in the business? You clear them too, or we shall be obliged to think ill of somebody. Laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion, my dearest Lizzie. Do but consider in what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner, one whom his father had promised to provide for. It is impossible. No man of common humanity, no man who had any of his character could be capable of it. Can his intimate friends be so excessively deceived in him? Oh no. I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on than that Mr. Wickham should invent such a history of himself as he gave me last night. Names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. If it be not so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in his books. It is difficult indeed. It is distressing. One does not know what to think. I beg your pardon. One knows exactly what to think. But Jane could think with certainty on only one point, that Mr. Bingley, if he had been imposed on, would have much to suffer when the affair became public. The two young ladies were summoned from the shrubbery where the conversation passed by the arrival of some of the very persons of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for their friend again called it an age since they had met, and what? They have met since Elizabeth and nothing at all to others. They were soon gone again, rising from their seats with an activity which took their brother by surprise and hurrying over the eager to escape from Mrs. Bennet's civilizations. I hope you hear my voice because there is some kind of issue with the image. It's shaking, so I will continue talking. Okay, let's go ahead. The prospect The prospect of the Netherfield ball was extremely agreeable to every female of the family. Mr. Bennet chose to consider it as given in compliment to her eldest daughter, and was particularly flattered by receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself. Instead of a ceremonious Cara Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends and the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything Mr. Darcy's looks and behaviour. She happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr. Wickham, he was able no means the only partner who could satisfy them, and a ball was at any rate a ball. And even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for it. "While I can have my mornings to myself," said she, "it is enough. I think it is not sacrifice to join occasionally evening engagements. Society has claims on us all, and I profess myself one of those who consider intervals of recreation and amusement as desirable for everybody." Elizabeth's spirits were so high on the occasions that, though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mrs. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join in the evening's amusement, and she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruple whatever on that head, and was very far from dreading a rebuke either from the Archbishop or Lady Catherine de Bourgh by venturing to dance. "I am by no means of opinion, I assure you," said he, "that a ball of his kind—" Hello, Alice. "I'm by no means of opinion, I assure you," said he, "that a ball of his kind, given by a young man of character to respectable people, can have any evil tendency, and I am so far from objecting to dancing myself that I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening, and I take this opportunity for soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the two first dances, especially a preference which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to the right cause, and not to any disrespect for her." Elizabeth felt herself completely taken in. She had fully proposed being engaged by Wickham for those very dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had been never worth time. There was no help for it. However, Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own was perforce delayed a little longer, and Mr. Collins' proposal accepted with as good a grace as she could. She was not the better pleased with his gallantry from the idea it suggested of something more. It now first struck her that she was selected from among her sisters as worthy of being the mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, and of assisting a foreign quadrille table at Rovings in the absence of more eligible visitors. The idea soon reached of to conviction as she observed his increasing civilities toward herself, and heard his frequent attempt at a compliment to her wit and vivacity, and so more astonished than gratified also by his effect of her dreams, of her charms. It was not long before her mother gave her to understand that the probability of their marriage was exceedingly agreeable to her. Elizabeth, however, did not choose to. What is this? What is this? And let's go to your channel and listed video. Okay. Okay, I'll come back into live in a few seconds because I guess the screen is shaking and I'm not sure what is happening right now. Sure that you want to stop streaming? Okay.